Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think this will come as a shock to members of the public because it's not something that we've been able to reveal publicly so far, because Sir Michael Astell QC, the judge in this case, was concerned that by revealing those links, the jury in this case would simply be too prejudiced and it would not be a fair trial. But over a 6-week period between January and March 2004, we can now tell you that on 4 separate occasions, 2 of the defendants in this case met with Mohammed Sadiq Khan, who you remember, of course, was the ringleader of the 7/7 attacks. He was the Edgware road bomber, and also with Shehzad Tanweer, he was the bomber at Aldgate. Men who, along with their accomplices, claimed a total of 52 lives. And I think what will be very disturbing about this is the fact that although the British security services did know who they were, they had no way of telling their future significance. They thought they were simply men on the periphery of this plot, the Fertiliser plot. They did have these men on their radar, and yet they were still unable to prevent them from just over a year later carrying out the 7/7 atrocity. And I think for the survivors of that incident, and in particular the relatives of those who died on 7/7, this will come as a very disturbing revelation indeed. Let me just tell you about the movements of the 2 groups to give you a little bit more detail about how in particular the ringleader of this gang, Omar Khayyam, met up along with his younger brother, who, it must be stressed, Shuja Mahmood, found not guilty of any involvement in this Fertiliser plot, but they met with Mohammed Sadiq Khan and Shehzad Tanweer on 4 separate occasions. On February the 2nd, 2004, Khan and his fellow 7/7 bomber Shehzad Tanweer were photographed near Leeds. They'd earlier met Omar Khayyam and his brother Shuja Mahmood. Now, 3 weeks later, on February the 21st, Khan was seen at Crawley, West Sussex, sitting in a car, again chatting with Omar Khayyam and his younger brother. Agents followed the group on that occasion along to Slough and Wellingborough. On the 28th of February, so a week after that, the MI5 agents were watching again at McDonald's in Crawley on that occasion as Mohammed Sadiq Khan and Shehzad Tanweer met Khayyam and his younger brother again. And on March the 23rd, Khan and Tanweer met Khayyam and Shuja on yet another occasion at Crawley, the group travelling on to East London and Slough. Now, it was a week after that that the Fertiliser bomb suspects were arrested. They were subsequently charged, leading to this case here in courtroom number 8 at the Old Bailey. But the jury in this case finding that although Omar Khayyam, the oldest of those 2 brothers, did indeed conspire to cause an explosion here in the UK, they completely absolved his younger brother from any part in that plot. He was found not guilty, and indeed his lawyers always argued that he had no awareness of any plot on the UK here. But certainly these links rather disturbing, and I think we will hear later on this afternoon from Assistant Commissioner Peter Clark. He, of course, is the head of the Metropolitan Police's anti-terror unit, and we expect to hear a little bit more from him about exactly what went wrong. But certainly from sources I've spoken to within Scotland Yard, what officers there will tell you is that they were simply balancing the priorities they had at the time with the amount of resources available. And just to give you a little bit of understanding about the scale of what they had on their plates, at the time of this surveillance operation, the surveillance operation that brought these men to justice back in January 2004, the police will tell you off the record that they were actually trying to survey 50 other terror cells. That was the extent of the operation they had going on. And just to give you an idea of how many people it takes to actually keep an eye on one single suspect, well, if you want to bug somebody, follow somebody for 24 hours, that, I'm told, involves 50 separate officers. So an enormous amount of resources. And I think what we'll hear from Assistant Commissioner Peter Clark later this afternoon is they simply didn't have the resources. They didn't know what the future significance of Mohammed Sadiq Khan and Shehzad Tanweer was at that time. They thought they were simply on the periphery of this plot. They knew they were engaged in minor fraud. They didn't think it went beyond that, and they believed that following up these men had to be their priority at the time. Now, this, of course, raises questions about the amount of resources available. Were there enough resources given to the British security services if the threat is as great as we understand that at the time they believed it was? But But I think this revelation of the link, of the fact that these two 7/7 bombers, even though the police didn't know who they were at that time, that they were on the radar, will be very, very upsetting to those who survived 7/7, and in particular those who lost relatives, who lost loved ones in that atrocity.
And what do we know of the intercept evidence, Rachel, that the officers who were following these two and encountered those meetings you described to us? What did they learn?
Well, it really was fascinating to hear so much intercept evidence in court, because it is quite unusual. So what happened was they took around 33,800 hours of these recordings, because they bugged the defendants' homes, their cars, and they even bugged the internet cafes they frequented. The jury shown CCTV footage as well, for example, of the storage depot where the fertiliser was being kept. They've shown pictures of Omar Khayyam, the ringleader, inspecting that fertiliser. The police had actually swapped his ammonium nitrate for something that wasn't dangerous, so they could watch him coming to and forth. But what was most interesting, I think, for the jury in this case was conversations that they heard, mostly between the defendants in this case, but on one occasion a conversation that was carried out between Omar Khayyam, the ringleader in this case, and Mohammed Sadiq Khan, the 7/7 ringleader. Now, of course, the jury weren't told who Omar Khayyam was talking to. He couldn't be identified as Mohammed Sadiq Khan because of the risk the judge ruled of prejudice, so they knew him simply as somebody called Ibrahim. But let me just tell you what that conversation was. Mohammed Sadiq Khan asked Omar Khayyam, the ringleader in this plot, "You're seriously, basically, a terrorist?" To which Omar Khayyam replied, "I'm not a terrorist, they're working through us." And Mohammed Sadiq Khan asked, "Who are? There's no one higher than you." Now, the jury, of course, realised that was an important conversation, but they will only now realise quite how telling that was, in the sense that Mohammed Sadiq Khan, and we know how much devastation he went on to wreak, believed Omar Khayyam to be the highest of them all.
And Rachel, you touched on this. You've talked about how those related to victims of the 7/7 bombings will feel, they'll be shocked to hear of these links, but there will be a general sense of outrage, won't they, that these people were on the radar already, these 7/7 bombers were already on the police's radar and nothing was done.
That's right, and I think that question will, of course, be put to Peter Clark, the head of the Met's anti-terror police, who we are expecting to speak to us a little later this afternoon about why these decisions were taken. Now, it's got to be stressed, of course, the police didn't identify them, they didn't know who they were, they couldn't understand at that point their future significance. But of course, the question people will be asking is, well, why didn't they stick with them? Why didn't they keep following them? If they'd kept them on the radar, then they would have known about the 7/7 plot and possibly been able to stop it before it took place. Now, this is something that has been looked into before. Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee last summer did make a report into this, into whether the police had taken the right decision. And despite the fact the police and the security services in the end decided not to follow up these links between Mohammed Sadiq Khan and Shehzad Tanweer and the people on this plot, despite that decision, the committee ruled, and if you'll allow me, I'll read you some of their findings, that they could not find fault. They ruled, "We conclude that in the light of the other priority investigations being conducted and the limitations on security service resources, the decisions not to give greater investigative priority to these two individuals were understandable." And as I was saying before, I think what you'll hear from the police is the fact that they simply couldn't know at the time how important these men were. And they had so much else going on that they had to weigh these things up, because they had a limited amount of resources and a huge amount of priorities.